In the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front of the Second World War entered a decisive stage. The Red Army's massive offensives in Belarus and Ukraine had torn open the Axis defensive system and brought Soviet troops deep into the territories of Eastern Europe. Operation Carpathian in June had effectively destroyed German Army Group Center, while the subsequent advance in the south threatened the borders of Hungary and the mountain passes leading into Central Europe. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, sought to maintain this momentum by forcing a passage through the Eastern Carpathians, a chain of rugged mountains forming a natural barrier between the Soviet-controlled plains of Ukraine and the Hungarian heartland. This line of defense became known in German planning as the Carpathian Gate. For the Axis, the Carpathians held both symbolic and strategic significance. The mountain range marked not only the frontier of the Hungarian state, but also the last formidable natural obstacle before the vast Hungarian plain. German planners, under pressure from Adolf Hitler, viewed the passes as critical strong points that had to be held at all costs. Hungary remained the Third Reich's last major ally in Eastern Europe, supplying oil, bauxite, and manpower. Should Soviet and Romanian forces break through, the Reich's southern flank would unravel, exposing Slovakia, Austria, and ultimately Germany itself. To prevent this, Berlin reinforced its Hungarian ally with elements of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, creating mixed formations tasked with fortifying mountain passes and delaying the Soviet advance for as long as possible. Romania's sudden political realignment added further complexity to the situation. On 23 August 1944, King Michael staged a coup d'état in Bucharest, overthrowing the pro-Axis government of Ion Antonescu and declaring war on Germany. Romania's defection instantly shifted the balance of power in the region. Once a major supplier of oil to the Axis, the country now opened its territory to Soviet troops and provided manpower for the campaign against Germany. The Romanian Army, restructured under Soviet supervision, marched northwards through Transylvania, aiming to reclaim territories ceded to Hungary under the Second Vienna Award of 1940. This dual political and military transformation transformed the Carpathians into a contested frontier between old allies turned enemies. The Soviet Union's objectives extended beyond purely military considerations. By pushing into the Carpathians and supporting Romania's re-entry into the Allied camp, Moscow aimed to secure influence over southeastern Europe. The Red Army's rapid occupation of Romanian territory already allowed Soviet representatives to impose political conditions on Bucharest, ensuring that Romania's new role as an ally would serve Soviet rather than Western interests. Control over the mountain passes would provide a gateway not only to Hungary, but also deeper into the Balkans, reinforcing Soviet dominance in the post-war settlement that was already beginning to take shape in the minds of Allied leaders. Hungary, meanwhile, found itself trapped between loyalty to Germany and the looming threat of invasion. Regent Miklos Horthy faced growing pressure from both domestic opposition and Allied diplomacy to seek an armistice. However, German occupation of Hungary in March 1944 had limited his government's autonomy. German military command effectively directed operations on Hungarian soil, and the Wehrmacht's defensive strategy prioritized holding key terrain even when it conflicted with Hungarian political concerns. As a result, Hungarian divisions were committed alongside German formations to hold the Eastern Carpathians, despite declining morale and the knowledge that Romania, once a fellow Axis partner, now stood against them. The soldiers who would fight in the Carpathian passes represented a diverse array of nations and units. On the Axis side, German formations included elements of the 8th Army and Waffen-SS units redeployed from other sectors, while the Hungarian Second Army provided additional divisions for defense. They were supported by smaller numbers of mountain troops experienced in rugged terrain, but stretched thin across a wide front. Facing them were Soviet forces from the 2nd and 4th Ukrainian Fronts, commanded by Generals Rodion Malinovsky and Ivan Konev. Their ranks included Soviet rifle divisions, mechanized units adapted for mountain warfare, and the newly restructured Romanian 4th Army under General Gheorghe Avramescu. The combined Soviet-Romanian force was numerically superior, yet its commanders knew that mountain warfare could neutralize advantages in manpower and armor. Intelligence assessments on both sides reflected uncertainty. German officers doubted whether the Soviets could sustain large-scale operations in the highlands before winter, while Soviet planners worried that Axis defenses, anchored by natural terrain, could delay the advance for months. Civilian populations in Transylvania and along the Carpathian foothills anticipated upheaval. Ethnically mixed communities of Romanians, Hungarians, Germans, and Jews faced not only the dangers of military operations, but also the risk of reprisals, occupation, and shifting political authority. By September 1944, as preparations intensified on both sides, the region braced itself for a confrontation that would determine the fate of Central Europe's southeastern gateway. Thus, the preconditions for the battles of the bloody Carpathian Gate were set: a fractured alliance system, a shifting balance of power following Romania's defection, the strategic importance of mountain terrain, and the looming clash between Axis defenders determined to hold back the tide, and Soviet-led forces resolved to force an entry into Central Europe. The stage was ready for a brutal confrontation that would test not only armies, but also the resilience of the populations caught in their path. By early September 1944, the Eastern Carpathians became the scene of active preparations for one of the most complex operations of the Eastern Front. The Soviet High Command assigned the Second Ukrainian Front under General Rodion Malinowski and the Fourth Ukrainian Front under General Ivan Konev to break through the mountain passes and enter Hungary from the east. Together, these two fronts deployed close to 1 million men, supported by over 1,600 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 1,800 aircraft. The Romanian Fourth Army, newly reorganized and rearmed under Soviet supervision, added another 13,000 soldiers. Their mission was to advance westward through Transylvania, seize Cluj and Oradea, and link up with forces pushing north through the passes of the Eastern Carpathians. On the Axis side, the German Eighth Army under General Otto Wöhler coordinated defensive operations, supported by the Hungarian Second Army. In total, Axis forces in the region numbered approximately 400,000 men, with around 400 tanks and assault guns and 600 aircraft. Though significantly outnumbered, their advantage lay in terrain and defensive preparation. The German command identified several mountain passes as focal points: the Tihuța, Borgo Pass, the Bicaz Gorge, and the Predeal Pass. Engineers and pioneer units constructed bunkers, minefields, and fortified positions designed to force the Red Army into narrow corridors, where armor could not maneuver and infantry would face prepared fire zones. The command structures on both sides reflected the growing importance of coalition warfare. Soviet generals oversaw not only their own formations, but also the Romanian contingents, integrating them into joint operational plans. Romanian officers faced the challenge of motivating troops who had recently been fighting alongside Germans against these very same Soviet formations. German commanders, for their part, had to coordinate closely with Hungarian officers who were increasingly skeptical of Berlin's strategic decisions. Disagreements emerged about whether Hungarian divisions should be concentrated in defense of Budapest or spread thin across the Carpathian frontier. Ultimately, Hitler's insistence on rigid defense left Hungarian troops committed to sectors where prospects for success were limited. The opening movements of September reflected this imbalance of planning. Soviet reconnaissance units probed the Carpathian ridges, testing the strength of Axis positions and identifying weak points. In some areas, they encountered stiff resistance from German Gebirgsjäger, elite mountain troops trained for operations in rugged terrain. These units, often reinforced with artillery carefully emplaced on heights, inflicted significant losses on advancing Soviet rifle divisions. Yet elsewhere, particularly where Romanian troops formed the bulk of the defense, Axis lines showed signs of fragility. Reports from German officers complained of insufficient ammunition, shortages of fuel, and low morale among Hungarian units unaccustomed to prolonged mountain warfare. Civilian populations along the advancing front experienced the upheaval of war for the second time in just a few years. Villages in Transylvania were evacuated as Soviet and Romanian artillery duels with German defenders set entire valleys aflame. Ethnic tensions added another layer of instability. Romanian communities often welcomed the Soviet Romanian advance as a chance to regain lost territories, while Hungarian communities feared reprisals and the loss of autonomy. In some areas, civilians were pressed into constructing fortifications, clearing roads, or providing intelligence. The presence of mixed populations made the region a fragile mosaic, vulnerable to both military and political pressures. The initial Soviet advances in early September were slower than expected. Stavka had anticipated that the collapse of Romania would open a rapid gateway through Transylvania, but the combination of fortified terrain, determined German resistance, and early autumn weather slowed progress. Rain turned mountain tracks into mud, limiting the mobility of Soviet mechanized units. Supply columns stretched for kilometers, often vulnerable to air attacks or sudden counterattacks launched from forested ridges. What was envisioned as a rapid thrust soon evolved into a grinding struggle in which every pass, valley, and ridgeline became a contested objective. From the perspective of the Red Army, these setbacks did not alter the strategic imperative. Orders from Moscow emphasized relentless pressure on the Axis defenses, with the knowledge that every week of delay gave Germany time to reinforce Hungary and reorganize its collapsing Eastern Front. For the Axis, holding the Carpathian Gate was seen as a matter of survival. Reports from German headquarters emphasized the need to buy time for fortifications to be prepared further west, even if it meant sacrificing thousands of men in defensive battles that could not be sustained indefinitely. Both sides understood that the campaign had entered a critical phase where terrain, weather, and logistics would shape outcomes as much as numbers and firepower. The opening engagements of September 1944 thus marked the transition from political realignment to military confrontation. The defection of Romania had shifted the balance of forces, but the mountains themselves imposed limits on what armies could achieve. Each side prepared for the heavy battles to come, aware that the struggle for the Carpathian Gate would determine whether the Axis could defend the heart of Central Europe or whether the Red Army would secure the pathways into Hungary and beyond. The strategic goals of both coalitions in the Carpathian campaign reflected not only military considerations, but also broader political ambitions. For the Soviet Union, the Eastern Carpathians represented a gateway to Central Europe and the chance to envelop Germany's last significant ally, Hungary. Stavka's operational orders for the 2nd and 4th Ukrainian Fronts called for the rapid capture of key mountain passes, the liberation of northern Transylvania, and the advance toward Debrecen and Budapest. Beyond the battlefield, Joseph Stalin sought to establish Soviet dominance over the Balkans and Central Europe before Western Allied forces could exert influence. The sooner Soviet troops entered Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the stronger Moscow's hand would be in post-war negotiations. Romania's objectives were more localized, but no less pressing. Having shifted sides in August 1944, the Romanian government under King Michael aimed to prove loyalty to the Allied cause by committing its army to major operations. The Romanian Fourth Army's task was to assist the Soviet push through Transylvania, retake territories awarded to Hungary in 1940, and reassert national sovereignty over ethnically mixed regions. For Romanian commanders, this also meant restoring morale among troops who had been compelled to fight alongside Germans for 3 years. Now, Romanian officers had to demonstrate discipline and determination in cooperation with their former enemies, the Red Army, while also confronting their former allies, the Hungarians. German and Hungarian strategic planning operated under very different constraints. Hitler's insistence on a rigid defense left the German Eighth Army and the Hungarian Second Army with orders to hold the Carpathian passes at all costs. For Berlin, the defense of Hungary was inseparable from the survival of the Reich. Hungarian oil fields in Nagy Kanica were among the last reliable fuel sources for the Wehrmacht, and losing them would cripple the ability of German panzer divisions to conduct operations. Therefore, German planners rejected proposals to withdraw to more defensible lines within Hungary, fearing that any retreat would accelerate collapse. Hungary's government faced conflicting pressures. Regent Miklós Horthy secretly explored the possibility of negotiating an armistice with the Allies, but German occupation in March 1944 had stripped him of real independence. The Hungarian army, ordered to defend passes and ridges under German command, had little room to maneuver politically or militarily. Their goal was to protect Hungarian territory and delay Soviet entry, but Hungarian officers also knew that excessive losses might weaken the state's ability to survive as an independent actor in the post-war order. Logistics played a decisive role in shaping plans. The Soviets and Romanians faced the challenge of supplying hundreds of thousands of men across mountain terrain with poor roads and limited rail access. Fuel and ammunition had to be hauled up narrow valleys, often requiring the use of horse-drawn carts in addition to motorized convoys. Bridges destroyed by German demolitions slowed movement, and the onset of autumn rains turned supply routes into mud. Soviet engineers were tasked with restoring railways and constructing temporary bridges, but the sheer scale of the task slowed the advance and strained resources. On the Axis side, logistical difficulties were equally severe. German supply lines stretched back across Hungary and Slovakia, vulnerable to air attacks and partisan activity. The Luftwaffe, tasked with providing air support, struggled with fuel shortages and could not maintain dominance over the mountainous terrain. Hungarian troops often relied on outdated artillery and lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons to counter Soviet armor, though in the narrow passes tanks were less decisive than in open plains. German commanders attempted to compensate with field fortifications, barbed wire, and carefully positioned artillery, but shortages of manpower meant that entire sectors were lightly held. Propaganda accompanied the military preparations on all sides. Soviet announcements framed the campaign as the liberation of Transylvania and the destruction of German strongholds, while Romanian state media emphasized national reunification. In Hungary, government propaganda urged citizens to resist Bolshevik invasion, portraying the struggle as a defense of the homeland. For German audiences, the defense of the Carpathians was presented as part of a broader effort to shield Europe from collapse. These narratives influenced morale among soldiers and civilians alike, though frontline experiences often contradicted the optimistic tone of official statements. Miscalculations shaped the opening strategies. Stavka underestimated the ability of German and Hungarian forces to mount stubborn defenses in mountain terrain, expecting a rapid breakthrough similar to earlier advances across the plains. Conversely, German commanders overestimated their capacity to hold indefinitely, assuming that terrain alone would neutralize Soviet superiority in numbers. Hungarian leaders, meanwhile, misjudged their population's willingness to endure another round of devastating battles on national soil, as disillusionment with the war spread among civilians. Thus, the strategic planning phase highlighted both ambition and constraint. The Soviets pursued a sweeping offensive with long-term geopolitical goals. The Romanians aimed to secure national restoration, while Germany and Hungary clung to defensive strategies that reflected both desperation and necessity. The plans laid down in early September set the stage for intense clashes where doctrine, supply, and morale would be tested against the unforgiving landscape of the Eastern Carpathians. The Soviet offensive into the Eastern Carpathians began in earnest in the second half of September 1944. On wide sectors stretching from Bukovina in the south to the passes leading into northern Transylvania, the Red Army, reinforced by Romanian divisions, launched probing attacks intended to force the Axis defenders out of their fortified lines. The first engagements quickly revealed the immense difficulties of mountain warfare. Soviet rifle divisions struggled to advance along narrow valleys, where German and Hungarian defenders used every slope and ridge to maximize their firepower. In the Bicaz Gorge, one of the most dramatic natural choke points of the region, German mountain troops and Hungarian infantry held fortified positions on steep cliffs overlooking the narrow road. Soviet infantry advancing through the valley floor faced artillery fire from concealed positions, while attempts to scale the rocky heights met with counterattacks by small but experienced Gebirgsjäger detachments. Similar scenes unfolded at the Tihuța Pass, where the 2nd Ukrainian Front's spearhead units were forced to halt under heavy defensive fire and minefields. Although Soviet forces had overwhelming artillery superiority, the effectiveness of bombardment was reduced by terrain. Shells detonated harmlessly against rock surfaces, and many targets were hidden in forests or behind ridgelines. Romanian units, advancing alongside Soviet forces, faced their own test of determination. In the Predeal Pass sector, Romanian divisions attempted to retake territory lost to Hungary in 1940. Here they fought against Hungarian troops of the Second Army, many of whom were defending their own homeland. The clashes were marked by bitter intensity, with both sides enduring heavy casualties in close-quarters combat. Romanian commanders noted that their soldiers' morale was strengthened by the prospect of reclaiming lost land. Yet, battlefield coordination with Soviet formations remained uneven. Language barriers, differing staff procedures, and the rapid pace of operations created friction within the coalition. Civilian populations in mountain villages bore the immediate consequences of these battles. Villages along the Oituz and Tihuța approaches were caught in artillery duels, forcing mass evacuations. Ethnic tensions were exacerbated as advancing Soviet and Romanian troops were sometimes welcomed by Romanian villagers, but resisted by Hungarian and German settlers. Reports from the German command noted difficulties in maintaining supply lines due to local hostility, while Soviet reports emphasized the assistance received from segments of the Romanian population. However, both sides also carried out requisitioning, adding to civilian hardships as food, livestock, and housing were consumed by the armies. Air power played a supporting role in these first engagements. The Soviet Air Force carried out bombing raids on Axis defensive positions and transport hubs in Transylvania, but mountainous terrain limited visibility and reduced effectiveness. German and Hungarian fighter units attempted to intercept, though dwindling fuel supplies and numerical inferiority restricted their operations. In many cases, both sides relied more heavily on artillery barrages than on airstrikes to shape the battlefield. Despite Axis defensive successes in the opening clashes, Soviet commanders maintained pressure. Probing attacks gradually revealed weaknesses in the line, particularly in sectors where Hungarian divisions, less well-equipped and less experienced than German mountain troops, bore the brunt of assaults. Soviet mechanized elements, although constrained by terrain, were occasionally able to exploit these gaps by moving along secondary valleys or forcing river crossings. By late September, both sides had suffered thousands of casualties, yet no decisive breakthrough had been achieved. The morale of soldiers in this phase reflected the grueling nature of the fighting. Soviet reports noted exhaustion among infantry forced to climb steep slopes under fire, but political officers emphasized the importance of pressing on to open the gateway into Hungary. German soldiers, aware of the larger collapse unfolding on the Eastern Front, were ordered to resist without retreat. Yet many recognized that the Carpathian line could not be held indefinitely. Hungarian troops fought with determination in defense of their own territory, but reports from German headquarters frequently cited shortages of ammunition, inadequate supplies, and wavering morale. Thus, the first engagements of the Carpathian campaign set the tone for the weeks to come. The Axis defenders demonstrated that they could delay a numerically superior opponent, but the Soviets and Romanians revealed their capacity for sustained pressure. The mountain passes became battlegrounds where tactical victories could not conceal the strategic dilemma. For the Axis, holding the line indefinitely was impossible, while for the Soviets, breaking through would require persistence, coordination, and sacrifices far greater than initial estimates had suggested. As the calendar turned to October 1944, the battles in the Eastern Carpathians escalated into a full-scale crisis for both sides. What had begun as probing engagements soon developed into prolonged and costly clashes, stretching across multiple passes and valleys. The Soviets committed larger formations to the fight, determined to break through before the onset of winter. The Axis, aware that each day of delay was critical for the defense of Hungary, poured reinforcements into the mountains despite already strained reserves elsewhere on the front. In the northern sector, the 4th Ukrainian Front launched repeated assaults on the Dukla Pass, the key corridor leading from the Soviet Union into Slovakia. There, Soviet rifle divisions, supported by armor that could be brought forward only with immense engineering effort, attacked entrenched German and Hungarian defenders. The defenders had transformed the pass into a fortress, with interlocking fields of fire, bunkers hidden in forests, and artillery zeroed in on narrow approach routes. Each Soviet advance was met by counterattacks from Gebirgsjäger units and Hungarian infantry, resulting in a battle of attrition. Casualty reports indicate that some Soviet rifle regiments lost more than half of their strength in a matter of days. The town of Dukla itself changed hands several times before remaining under Soviet control, but the overall pace of progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Farther south, along the Oituz and Trotuș valleys, Romanian divisions fought under Soviet coordination. Their task was to force the Predeal and Oituz passes, thereby opening the way toward Brașov and central Transylvania. Resistance was stiff. Hungarian artillery units, supported by German anti-tank detachments, inflicted heavy losses on advancing Romanian infantry. The narrowness of the valleys meant that entire battalions were exposed to concentrated fire, while mines and demolitions repeatedly stalled progress. Reports from Romanian staff officers noted the strain on morale as casualties mounted, though the political significance of retaking Transylvanian territory remained a motivating factor. On the Axis side, the crisis deepened as defensive lines were increasingly stretched. German 8th Army headquarters directed constant redeployments, shifting battalions from one threatened pass to another. This mobility was achieved at the cost of exhaustion and logistical strain. Troops often marched for days across mountain trails, arriving at new positions with little rest or supplies. Hungarian divisions, less motorized than their German counterparts, suffered particularly from inadequate transport. Ammunition shortages became acute, with some Hungarian artillery units rationing shells to only a handful per day. Weather compounded the difficulties. Early autumn rains turned mountain tracks into mud, making movement for supply convoys nearly impossible. Horses and oxen pulled carts laden with ammunition and food, but many collapsed from overwork or starvation. Soviet engineers attempted to construct temporary roads and bridges, while Axis pioneers mined and destroyed them in turn. This cycle of destruction and repair slowed operations to a crawl and placed enormous strain on both armies' logistical systems. Political pressures added to the intensity of the crisis. Stalin demanded continued offensives, insisting that the Red Army must push into Hungary before the year's end. Malinovsky and Konev relayed these orders to their subordinates, urging persistence despite mounting losses. For Romania, continued commitment to the offensive was essential to demonstrate loyalty to the Allies and secure recognition of post-war territorial claims. The Romanian government therefore pressured its generals to maintain momentum, even as reports from the field emphasized the cost in manpower. For Germany, Hitler's directives left no room for retreat. Orders from the Führer's headquarters declared the Carpathian passes fortresses to be held to the last man. Commanders were warned that unauthorized withdrawals would be punished severely. This rigid approach created tactical dilemmas, as local officers could not adjust to changing conditions without risking disciplinary measures. German staff documents reveal frustration among senior officers who believed that limited withdrawals could have preserved combat power. But the political climate left such proposals impossible. Civilian populations experienced the consequences of escalation directly. Entire villages and mountain valleys were destroyed during artillery exchanges. Refugees fled into forests or attempted to cross into safer areas of Transylvania, often under fire. Both Soviet and Axis forces requisitioned supplies, leaving little for local inhabitants. Ethnic tensions deepened. Hungarian villagers feared reprisals from advancing Romanian troops, while Romanian communities feared counteractions by retreating Hungarian soldiers. For many civilians, the campaign became a struggle for survival amid shifting front lines. By mid-October, the casualty figures reflected the scale of the crisis. Estimates suggest that Soviet and Romanian forces suffered more than 7,000 losses in the Carpathian fighting during this period, while German and Hungarian casualties exceeded 3,000. Despite these costs, the front remained fluid but unresolved. The Soviets had secured partial breakthroughs in some passes, yet the Axis line as a whole had not collapsed. The crisis of the Carpathian campaign thus lay not only in its ferocity, but in its indecisiveness. Both coalitions expended enormous resources, yet neither achieved the decisive result they sought. The stage was set for further escalation as winter approached and the struggle for control of Central Europe intensified. By late October 1944, the Carpathian campaign reached its peak. Both sides had already endured weeks of exhausting combat, yet the strategic stakes demanded even greater effort. For the Soviet Second and Fourth Ukrainian Fronts, the breakthrough into Hungary was essential to sustain momentum and prevent the Axis from stabilizing its front. For the German Eighth Army and its Hungarian allies, the Carpathians became a last shield before the Hungarian plain. The fighting intensified into some of the harshest operations of the Eastern Front's mountainous theaters. One of the largest operations unfolded in the southern sector, where Soviet forces concentrated against the Predeal and Oituz passes. The Red Army committed multiple rifle corps, supported by artillery brigades and armored units brought forward with extraordinary engineering effort. Soviet tanks, often immobilized on muddy mountain tracks, had to be winched by teams of tractors and horses, yet their presence provided critical firepower once deployed on more level ground near valleys. Romanian divisions fought alongside them, determined to retake Brașov and the surrounding Transylvanian plateau. Axis defenders, composed largely of Hungarian infantry, reinforced by German assault gun detachments, fought bitterly from fortified ridgelines. Casualty reports from both sides indicated thousands of losses within days, as infantry repeatedly stormed slopes under heavy artillery fire. In the north, the battle for the Dukla Pass escalated into one of the bloodiest engagements of the campaign. The 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, fighting under Soviet command, entered combat alongside Soviet rifle divisions. This force, composed of exiles and volunteers, aimed to liberate Slovak territory as part of the ongoing Slovak national uprising. Their presence symbolized the multinational character of the offensive. Soviet, Romanian, and Czechoslovak soldiers fought together against German and Hungarian units defending the Slovak frontier. The struggle for Dukla saw relentless artillery duels, house-to-house combat in mountain villages, and repeated counterattacks. By the end of October, Soviet forces had finally forced the pass, but at the cost of more than 8,000 casualties across several weeks of battle. German and Hungarian defenders, though heavily depleted, inflicted losses that far exceeded Soviet expectations. The intensity of operations strained command systems on all sides. Soviet generals, under constant pressure from Stalin, urged greater efforts even as regiments reported critical shortages of ammunition and food. Romanian commanders, balancing political expectations with battlefield realities, complained of overextension and heavy losses. On the Axis side, German headquarters issued increasingly unrealistic orders to hold at all costs, ignoring local officers' appeals for tactical withdrawals. Hungarian staff officers, while motivated to defend national territory, faced growing disillusionment as casualties mounted and supplies dwindled. Coordination between German and Hungarian units sometimes broke down under pressure, leading to gaps in the line that the Soviets attempted to exploit. Civilian suffering deepened during this peak phase of combat. Entire regions of northern Transylvania became depopulated as villagers fled the advancing front. Food shortages turned severe as both armies requisitioned livestock and grain. In areas where front lines shifted repeatedly, civilians were exposed to reprisals, accusations of collaboration, and forced labor. The destruction of infrastructure compounded the crisis. Rail lines were torn up, bridges blown, and roads cratered by bombardments. Reports from both sides described refugees clogging mountain passes, competing with military traffic and slowing supply convoys. Weather conditions in late October and early November added another layer of hardship. Heavy rains gave way to the first snowfalls, covering ridges in ice and making trails treacherous. Frostbite and exposure became serious problems for inadequately equipped troops, particularly Hungarian and Romanian units with limited winter gear. Soviet supply officers struggled to provide warm clothing and boots for their men, while German logistics were hampered by fuel shortages that restricted the delivery of essential supplies. The onset of winter made further operations increasingly costly, yet political and strategic imperatives ensured that the fighting continued without pause. The peak of the Carpathian campaign thus reflected the convergence of military intensity and human endurance. Battles for Dukla, Predeal, and Oituz consumed entire divisions, reducing some units to fractions of their original strength. Armored brigades were ground down by terrain, as much as by enemy fire, while infantry bore the brunt of relentless assaults and counterattacks. By November 1944, both coalitions faced exhaustion, yet neither could abandon the struggle. The Soviets required a breakthrough to fulfill their operational timetable, while the Axis needed to hold the line to protect the Hungarian heartland. At its height, the Carpathian campaign had transformed the mountain passes into killing grounds where terrain and weather combined with human determination to produce some of the most grueling battles of the Eastern Front. The cost was immense, but the contest remained unresolved, setting the stage for the eventual turning point that would decide control of the Carpathian Gate. By November 1944, the long and grueling campaign in the Eastern Carpathians entered a phase of resistance and adaptation. Both coalitions, exhausted by months of combat, sought new ways to sustain operations, despite mounting losses and deteriorating conditions. The mountainous terrain, combined with the onset of harsh weather, forced commanders to modify tactics, while soldiers on the ground improvised to survive and fight. On the Soviet and Romanian side, adaptation meant reorganizing formations to maintain combat capability. Rifle divisions reduced to half their strength were consolidated, with remaining units redistributed into composite regiments. Engineers played an increasingly important role, constructing corduroy roads across muddy valleys, repairing destroyed bridges, and hauling supplies with teams of oxen and horses. Where tanks and trucks could not pass, supplies were carried by mule columns or even by soldiers themselves. The Soviet command also relied heavily on local resources, requisitioning carts, livestock, and manpower from Romanian villages to keep supply lines functioning. Romanian troops, still adjusting to their new role as allies of the Soviet Union, showed mixed performance. Some units fought with determination in sectors tied to reclaiming Transylvanian territory, while others struggled with morale under the burden of heavy casualties. Soviet liaison officers were attached to Romanian divisions to ensure coordination and discipline. Over time, cooperation improved as joint operations and shared hardships fostered practical, if uneasy, bonds between the armies. For the Axis, adaptation was equally vital. German Gebirgsjäger units demonstrated their expertise in mountain warfare, launching small-scale counterattacks, ambushes, and night raids to harass Soviet positions. These tactics slowed enemy progress and inflicted disproportionate losses, even when the Axis lacked resources for large-scale offensives. Hungarian infantry, though less well-trained for mountain combat, improvised by fortifying village houses and church towers, turning settlements into strong points that forced Soviet troops into costly assaults. Local civilians were sometimes conscripted to dig trenches or carry supplies, adding another layer of strain to populations already suffering from displacement. The resistance took on a dynamic quality as Axis forces exploited their knowledge of the terrain. In narrow valleys and forested ridges, German units set demolition charges to collapse slopes onto advancing columns, or destroyed bridges at the last moment to strand Soviet vehicles. These delaying actions could not permanently halt the offensive, but they bought time. Each day gained allowed the Wehrmacht to reinforce positions deeper inside Hungary, preparing defenses along the Tihuța River and around Debrecen. Partisan movements also played a role in this stage. In Slovakia, the Slovak national uprising had been suppressed by German forces in October, but remnants of partisan units continued operations in the mountains. These groups disrupted German supply convoys, gathered intelligence for the Soviets, and occasionally joined advancing Soviet units when they crossed the frontier. For the Axis, partisans created an additional burden, forcing them to divert troops to rear area security, even as front lines demanded more men. The psychological toll of the campaign grew evident in soldiers' accounts. Soviet troops endured weeks of climbing ridges under fire, often with little rest or shelter from the cold. Letters and diaries described exhaustion, frostbite, and hunger, but also determination to press on, reinforced by political officers' reminders of the campaign's importance. German and Hungarian soldiers, in turn, expressed fatigue and frustration at the endless defensive battles. The knowledge that the broader Eastern Front was collapsing undermined morale, though local commanders emphasized the defense of Hungarian soil as a patriotic duty. Civilian endurance was stretched to the limit. In Transylvanian towns such as Sfântu Gheorghe and Miercurea Țiuc, repeated occupations left inhabitants facing reprisals from whichever army temporarily controlled the area. Food shortages became severe, with bread and livestock requisitioned by both sides. Refugees crowded into safer valleys or crossed into neighboring regions, sometimes only to find themselves once again in the path of advancing armies. Accounts from the period highlight the improvisation of families who survived by hiding food, seeking shelter in forests, or relying on extended kinship networks. Innovation also emerged from necessity. Soviet artillery units devised methods to drag light guns up steep slopes using teams of men and cables, allowing them to bombard positions that defenders considered safe. German pioneers constructed concealed bunkers camouflaged with snow and foliage, enabling defenders to fire on attackers at close range before retreating to secondary lines. Hungarian units improvised winter clothing from civilian textiles, sewing together makeshift coats and boots to withstand the cold. These adaptations, though small, reflected the determination of all sides to persist despite overwhelming hardship. By the end of November, the Carpathian campaign had evolved into a war of attrition shaped by resilience. Neither side achieved decisive breakthroughs, yet neither collapsed. The Soviets and Romanians pushed steadily westward, while German and Hungarian forces withdrew reluctantly from some sectors but continued to resist fiercely in others. This balance of advance and delay set the stage for a critical shift. As winter deepened, the campaign would reach a turning point that would decide the fate of Hungary and the Carpathian frontier. December 1944 marked the turning point of the Carpathian campaign. After nearly 3 months of continuous fighting, both coalitions had reached the limits of endurance. The Soviets, despite heavy casualties and the strain of mountain warfare, began to achieve significant breakthroughs, while the Axis, stretched thin and lacking reserves, struggled to maintain cohesion. The battles of this period determined whether the Carpathian Gate would remain closed or open fully to the Soviet advance into Hungary. In the north, the Fourth Ukrainian Front pressed relentlessly through the Dukla Pass into Slovakia. By December, German and Hungarian forces defending the sector were reduced to fragments of their original strength. The 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, though battered, remained committed to pushing into Slovak territory and linking with local partisan groups. Soviet artillery finally overwhelmed many of the fortified positions that had held for weeks, and supply routes through the pass were opened. The cost was staggering. Soviet and Czechoslovak losses numbered over $1,000 by the time the pass was secured, while Axis losses, though smaller, effectively destroyed several divisions. The fall of Dukla symbolized the breaking of the northern Carpathian barrier. In the central sector, the Soviet Second Ukrainian Front intensified its efforts in Transylvania. Romanian divisions spearheaded advances toward Cluj, reclaiming territory awarded to Hungary under the Vienna Award. The battles for the mountain towns of Sfântu Gheorghe and Târgu Secuiesc became decisive moments. After weeks of artillery bombardments and infantry assaults, Axis forces began to withdraw, unable to hold under the combined pressure of Soviet mechanized brigades and Romanian infantry. German staff reports admitted that supply lines had collapsed, with ammunition arriving too late or in insufficient quantities. Hungarian commanders, facing mounting losses and declining morale, urged withdrawal to the Hungarian plain, but Hitler's orders again insisted on resistance. Further south, the Oituz and Predeal passes finally fell after prolonged fighting. Romanian and Soviet units forced German defenders out of Brașov, opening access to central Transylvania. The capture of Brașov and its surrounding rail junctions was strategically significant, as it provided the Soviets with logistical routes for further advances westward. For the Axis, the loss of these positions marked the collapse of their defensive system in the southern Carpathians. Retreating German and Hungarian troops attempted to regroup along the Mureș River, but their positions were tenuous, with Soviet forces pressing on multiple fronts. The turning point was not solely military but also political. In Hungary, Regent Miklós Horthy attempted in October to negotiate an armistice with the Allies, but German forces launched Operation Panzerfaust, deposing Horthy and installing the pro-German Aerocross regime under Ferenc Szalasi. This development tied Hungary even more tightly to Germany, ensuring that its army would continue fighting even as defeat loomed. For Soviet planners, the change in Hungary eliminated any possibility of negotiated surrender, and confirmed that the Red Army would have to conquer Hungarian territory by force. Civilian populations experienced the consequences of this turning point, as both armies intensified operations. In Transylvania, villages emptied as people fled bombardments, while partisan groups in Slovakia and northern Hungary increased their activities, disrupting Axis supply lines. German authorities responded with reprisals, further alienating local populations. Soviet and Romanian troops, though officially instructed to respect civilians, also requisitioned food and housing, leaving many communities impoverished. Refugees moved westward in waves, creating humanitarian crises in towns already strained by the presence of retreating Axis troops. The Axis collapse in the Carpathians became evident by late December. German divisions, reduced to half or less of their original strength, could no longer mount effective counterattacks. Hungarian units, though still fighting on national soil, suffered desertions and declining morale. Equipment losses were severe. Dozens of tanks and assault guns abandoned in mountain passes, hundreds of artillery pieces left behind during hurried withdrawals, and thousands of prisoners taken by advancing Soviet and Romanian units. For the Soviets and Romanians, the breakthrough represented both victory and opportunity. The Carpathian Gate was now open, allowing access to the Hungarian plain and the approaches to Budapest. Stavka immediately redirected forces to exploit this opening, preparing for the assault on Hungary's capital. Romanian leaders proclaimed the restoration of Transylvania, a political victory that bolstered their alliance with the Soviets despite tensions. The Czechoslovak corps entered Slovak territory, symbolizing the revival of national sovereignty under Soviet sponsorship. The turning point of December 1944 thus marked the end of the Carpathians as a defensive line. What had been envisioned by German planners as an impregnable barrier had been breached at enormous cost. For the Soviets and Romanians, the breakthrough validated months of sacrifice and positioned them for the decisive battles to come in Hungary. For Germany and Hungary, the collapse of the mountain defenses meant confronting the grim reality that the war was now advancing into the heart of Central Europe, with no natural obstacles left to slow the Red Army's progress toward Budapest and beyond. By January 1945, the campaign in the Eastern Carpathians had effectively concluded, giving way to the next phase of the war, the advance across the Hungarian plain and the encirclement of Budapest. The immediate aftermath of the Carpathian fighting was marked by retreat, reorganization, and devastation. Axis forces withdrew in disorder, while Soviet and Romanian armies struggled to consolidate their gains in a shattered landscape. The German Eighth Army, heavily depleted, attempted to regroup along the Tihuța River line in eastern Hungary. Reports from German staff indicate that divisions which had entered the Carpathian battles with 8,000 to 1,000 men often emerged with only 3,000 to 4,000 effectives. Hungarian formations were in even worse condition, many reduced to skeletal units with barely a battalion's worth of combat-ready soldiers. Equipment losses were severe. Artillery abandoned in mountain passes, tanks immobilized for lack of fuel, and supply depots destroyed by Soviet air raids. The Wehrmacht transferred reinforcements from Austria and Slovakia, but these were insufficient to offset the damage inflicted by months of attritional warfare. Soviet and Romanian forces, though victorious, were equally strained. Casualty figures for the entire Carpathian campaign are estimated at over 2,000 for the Soviets and Romanians combined, including killed, wounded, and missing. Many rifle divisions were operating at 1/3 of their authorized strength. The logistical burden of sustaining operations in mountainous terrain left supply systems exhausted. Horses, mules, and motor vehicles alike had been consumed by the demands of the campaign, leaving the advancing fronts short of transport capacity just as they prepared for the next offensive toward Budapest. The civilian impact of the campaign became fully apparent in its aftermath. Entire villages in Transylvania and northern Romania lay in ruins, with homes destroyed by artillery and fields left untended. The repeated passage of armies devastated the local economy. Livestock was requisitioned, food stocks consumed, and labor forced into military service. Refugee movements reshaped the demographic map of the region. Romanian families who had fled Hungarian-controlled territories began to return, while Hungarian civilians retreated westward in fear of reprisals. Jewish communities, already shattered by deportations earlier in the war, faced further hardship as surviving members sought to navigate the chaos of shifting front lines. The humanitarian crisis was compounded by winter. Harsh weather left thousands of civilians without adequate shelter, dependent on improvised arrangements in cellars, barns, or makeshift camps. Epidemics of typhus and influenza spread in overcrowded conditions. Relief was scarce. Romanian authorities struggled to provide basic services in recaptured areas, while Soviet military administrations prioritized securing supply routes over civilian welfare. German retreating units often destroyed infrastructure to deny its use to the enemy, further worsening conditions for local populations. On the political front, Romania celebrated the return of northern Transylvania, a central objective since its defection to the Allies. Ceremonies in Bucharest marked the restoration of national territory, though under Soviet oversight. The presence of Soviet troops on Romanian soil and the dominance of Soviet advisors in Romanian military planning highlighted the price of this achievement. In Slovakia, the breakthrough at Dukla allowed Soviet and Czechoslovak units to link up with remnants of the Slovak national uprising, though the uprising itself had been crushed. This reinforced the perception of Soviet power as the decisive factor in the region's liberation, shaping post-war political realities. For Hungary, the aftermath was catastrophic. The failure to hold the Carpathian passes left the country exposed to direct invasion. German efforts to maintain control through the Arrow Cross regime only deepened civilian suffering. Conscription campaigns swept through Hungarian towns and villages, drafting underaged and poorly trained men into hastily assembled formations. At the same time, the Arrow Cross regime intensified repression, targeting political opponents and minority populations. The collapse of the Carpathian Front thus coincided with the radicalization of Hungary's internal politics under German pressure. Militarily, the withdrawal from the Carpathians set the stage for the Battle of Budapest. Soviet and Romanian armies, despite their exhaustion, pressed forward to encircle the Hungarian capital. The loss of the mountain defenses meant there were no natural obstacles left to slow the advance. German attempts to stabilize the front along the Tihuța River provided only temporary respite. By late December 1944, Soviet spearheads had already reached the outskirts of Budapest, beginning a siege that would last into February 1945. The legacy of the Carpathian fighting for the soldiers who survived was one of fatigue and trauma. Soviet veterans described the campaign as one of the hardest in the war, with terrain and weather compounding the enemy's resistance. German and Hungarian survivors remembered endless defensive battles fought with inadequate supplies and little hope of reinforcement. Romanian troops, though buoyed by the recovery of national territory, suffered from some of the heaviest casualties in their wartime history. The mountains, once seen as natural fortresses, became cemeteries for tens of thousands of men on both sides. Thus, the aftermath of the bloody Carpathian Gate was defined by retreat, devastation, and transition. The Axis had failed to hold the mountain barrier, the Soviets had paid a staggering price for their breakthrough, and civilians endured destruction on a scale that reshaped entire regions. The campaign's end marked not peace, but the continuation of war, now moving decisively into the heart of Hungary, where the fate of Central Europe would be decided in the months that followed. The legacy of the Carpathian campaign extended far beyond the battlefield. Although the fighting in the passes concluded by late 1944, its consequences shaped the political, military, and cultural landscape of Central and Eastern Europe for decades to come. The bloody Carpathian Gate became both a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the costs of a war fought across unforgiving terrain. From a military perspective, the campaign demonstrated the limits of defensive warfare in the face of overwhelming numerical superiority. German planners had envisioned the Carpathians as an impregnable fortress, but even mountains could not halt the combined weight of Soviet manpower and material. Nevertheless, the Axis defenders had inflicted such heavy casualties that Soviet operations were delayed and weakened, altering the timetable of the advance toward Budapest. Analysts later noted that the Carpathians consumed resources on a scale disproportionate to the strategic gain, highlighting the brutal calculus of attritional warfare. For Romania, the campaign marked both sacrifice and redemption. Having changed sides in August 1944, Romania committed its army to prove loyalty to the Allies. The cost was immense. Romanian divisions lost tens of thousands of men in some of their fiercest fighting of the entire war. Yet their participation ensured the restoration of northern Transylvania, a political goal that had defined Romanian strategy since the Second Vienna Award. The experience also bound Romania more tightly to the Soviet sphere, as the Red Army's presence and influence in Bucharest grew stronger in the campaign's aftermath. Hungary experienced the campaign as both a national tragedy and a political turning point. The failure to defend the Carpathians left the country open to invasion, and the Arrow Cross regime, installed under German auspices, led Hungary into a final phase of destruction. Hungarian soldiers, many defending their homeland in desperate conditions, suffered catastrophic losses, while civilians faced occupation, repression, and the collapse of state authority. For post-war Hungary, the memory of the Carpathians became part of a broader narrative of national sacrifice during the closing months of the war. In Czechoslovakia and Slovakia, the battles carried symbolic weight. The breakthrough at Dukla Pass allowed Soviet and Czechoslovak forces to cross into Slovak territory, fulfilling a promise of liberation, though at terrible cost. The Slovak national uprising had already been crushed, but the campaign reinforced the idea of Czechoslovakia's return to the Allied camp. It also illustrated the role of multinational cooperation. Soviet, Romanian, and Czechoslovak troops fought side by side, foreshadowing the post-war political alignment of Eastern Europe under Soviet dominance. Civilian memory of the Carpathian fighting remained vivid long after the war. For many Transylvanian communities, the campaign was remembered less for its strategic outcomes than for the devastation it brought. Villages burned, families displaced, and populations reshaped by refugee flows left scars that endured for generations. Oral histories from the region often recount the hardships of winter flight, the destruction of harvests, and the uncertainty of life under alternating occupations. Historiography of the campaign has reflected broader political currents. In Soviet and Romanian narratives of the immediate post-war era, the campaign was presented as a heroic liberation effort, emphasizing the cooperation between the Red Army and its new allies. Hungarian and German accounts, written in exile or under censorship, portrayed it as a tragic but honorable defense of homeland against insurmountable odds. Western scholarship, appearing later, sought to balance these perspectives by highlighting the immense human cost and the operational challenges of mountain warfare. Commemoration has taken many forms. Monuments at Dukla, Predeal, and Oituz honor the dead, while military cemeteries scattered across the Carpathians testify to the scale of sacrifice. Annual ceremonies in Slovakia and Romania recall the contributions of Soviet, Czechoslovak, and Romanian troops, often framed within national narratives of liberation or unity. In Hungary, memory of the campaign has been more contested, tied to debates about wartime responsibility, collaboration, and victimhood. The historical significance of the bloody Carpathian Gate lies not only in its immediate military outcome, but also in its role as a crossroads of nations, ideologies, and human experiences. The campaign demonstrated the complexity of coalition warfare, the resilience of soldiers and civilians under extreme conditions, and the way geography can shape the course of history. Its legacy is one of both triumph and tragedy, a decisive step toward the collapse of Axis power in Central Europe, achieved at a cost measured in ruined villages, shattered armies, and countless lives. In the broader narrative of the Second World War, the Carpathian battles may not hold the same prominence as Stalingrad or Kursk, Yet they illustrate the grinding reality of a conflict fought on every terrain, from vast steppes to mountain passes. For the peoples of Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Ukraine, the Carpathians of 1944 remain a reminder of a moment when war swept across their mountains, altering borders, politics, and lives in ways that would shape the future of the region long after the guns fell silent.